In other stories, the U.S. Department of Transportation has banned all flights of Pakistani International Airlines with immediate effect.
Sky highways have been established for air traffic, known as civil airways. All their traffic is covered by regulations.
Officials in the U.S. raised concern over pilot certifications and highlighted how PIA.
Good day, Patsians! Welcome to one of our presentations. For this video, we will talk about the 9 freedoms of air that is created and published by the International Civil Aviation Organization.
Most of us, if not all, simply thought that it is through the diplomatic relations formed over the years and decades of war that the travel rules and regulations were established, and all have simply been given equal rights in flying freely in the sky from nation to nation. Well, this is not entirely true at all. For even in the travel of international waters and across borders, there are certain rules, regulations, and requirements that must be met. For as wide as the sea may be, and as free as the sky may look, there are rules, regulations, and most importantly, rights and limitations that must be established.
There are several obstacles to be taken care of if an airline wants to commence service between its country of origin and another country. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of bilateral air service and transit agreements between the different states. This is quite logical, since every country has its own economic interests. A stranger airline conquering the own market and grabbing all market shares is certainly not among those. Here are some points that those bilateral or multilateral agreements deal with.
To facilitate the whole procedures of treaties and agreements, the International Civil Aviation Organization invented the freedoms of the air. Those can be seen as a foundation for the worldwide flying network. The word freedom, however, is quite misleading, since all freedoms of the air are only valid within the framework of the bi- or multilateral agreements that have been mentioned. Freedoms of the air are economic and diplomatic protocols agreed to by states for the commercial flow of revenue traffic by air. They are not to be confused with state civil aviation organizations and ICAO standards and recommended practices or SARPS. There are 9 basic freedoms of the air. These freedoms or rights are only valid when the states involved sign the appropriate bilateral or multilateral agreements.
The first freedom talks about the right or freedom of an airline owned by a country to fly over a different or another country without the need of landing. This simply means that when an airline of a particular country is bound to fly to another, however, since it needs to cross another country's airspace, it will just fly over that different country to be able to get to its designated country in which it has the right to do so. To further understand this first freedom of air, an example is that this right would allow Emirates Airline to fly over multiple countries en route to America. Another example is that Philippine Airline, bound to Singapore, has the right to fly over Malaysia just to get to Singapore.
So, the second freedom is the freedom or the right of an airline of a country to land in a different country for the reason of non-traffic purposes while en route to another country. So, traffic purposes refers to transportation of passengers, cargo, or mail, while non-traffic purposes naman are refueling or carrying out maintenance procedures. So, meaning, allowed ang isang aircraft na mag-stop over sa certain airport na to na madadaanan niya before yung final destination niya only for non-traffic purposes. And also, this freedom doesn't grant you the right to transport people or goods dun sa country na pinaglandan mo to conduct non-traffic purposes. So, for example, Air New Zealand will be allowed to land in the US to carry on maintenance. and to fly onto London provided that it did not load or unload passengers, cargo, or mail.
The Multilateral Exchange of Freedoms 1 and 2 is also known as the International Air Services Transit Agreement during the Chicago Conference. The first two freedoms were considered as the most complicated among all freedoms. This is an agreement between the states in terms of services of rights of overflight and stops for non-traffic purposes or such as known as transit right. However, further exchange of commercial traffic rights for such non-scheduled services relatively uncommon in practice during the Chicago Conference was also included in the convention, but due to the restrictive interpretation given by the contracting states to the relevant proposition in the convention made it unsuccessful.
The third freedom of air gives the right for air services to carry traffic from their home country and land in another country. Traffic includes passenger, cargo, mail, and etc. This is one of the most common freedoms of air you can observe today, as airlines rely on this freedom of air to make a profit themselves and of course provide services to their customers. There are still some restrictions apply, as airlines have designated landing locations in a specific country. For example, the third freedom of air allows Philippine Airlines to transport passengers from the city of Manila to the city of Dubai in the United Arab Emirates.
The fourth freedom of the air talks about the right or privilege in respect of scheduled international air services granted by one state to another state to take on. In the territory of the first state, traffic destined for the home state of the carrier. The fourth freedom of right pertains to the right of an airline to carry traffic from a foreign country to its own country. The third freedom of right works in collaboration with the fourth freedom of rights. The third amongst the freedom of the air grants the right to carry passengers and or freight from the airline's home country to a country abroad. This is quite self-explanatory. In reality, however, this can become quite difficult, since the third freedom of right is often bound to certain restrictions. Emirates, for instance, must only fly to 4 German airports currently. Those are, at the moment, Dusseldorf, Hamburg, Frankfurt, and Main and Munich. Of course, we want to have our aircraft back at some point in time. And since not all passengers want to emigrate, it would be quite useful to fly back home. This is where the fourth freedom of right steps into the game. The fourth freedom grants the right to fly passengers and cargo from a foreign country back home.
The fifth freedom rights pertains to the right of an airline of one country to land in a foreign country, pick up and deliver traffic and then fly to a second foreign country. This freedom right is confined to flights that originate or terminate in the airline's home country. In other words, it allows the operation of commercial flights between foreign states if the origin or destination of the flight is the airline's home state. To understand the reason behind this freedom rights creation, we have to go back several decades before. During the early ages of the aviation industry, commercial airplanes had shorter range and there was less passenger demand. The fifth freedom routes that create the multi-stop routes made it possible for airlines to profitably operate flights to faraway destination. So as you can see in the photo reference in our slide, Saudi Arabian can create flights originating from its home, which is Saudi Arabia, and travel passengers or cargo to a foreign country, which is Hong Kong, and allowing it or given rights to travel again to another foreign country, which is the Philippines. Vice versa, Saudi Arabian has given the privilege or right to originate a flight from a foreign country, travel to another foreign country, which is Hong Kong, and then go back or terminate the flight finally to the Saudi Arabia or their home state.
The fifth freedom rights perfectly applies to the trans-Tasman market. The trans-Tasman market refers to the attempt of creating a single aviation market between Australia and New Zealand, which highlighted aspects of the reform of international air transport policy using regional arrangements. Through the fifth freedom rights, let's say Thai Airways fly 747s from Bangkok to Australian airports. These flights typically arrive in the morning. Given the time differences and flying times, in order for Thai's return flights from Australia to Bangkok to connect with evening outgoing flights from Bangkok, Thai's return flight do not leave until late evening. Accordingly, Thai's plane is idle during that period. The Fifth Freedom rights then allow Thai to utilize the idle plane to fly trans-Tasman routes. Thai can provide seats on these trans-Tasman services at close marginal cost, since any revenue received above the marginal cost will contribute towards Thai's fixed cost, because in the absence of the trans-Tasman service, the aircraft would just be idle. To know other examples of the Fifth Freedom routes, we have the Singapore Fifth Freedom routes that is explained in the following video.
Singapore Airlines Fifth Freedom Routes, an ultimate guide. Singapore Airlines is highly regarded for having fantastic service in all of its classes. While many travellers would love the opportunity to experience the airline, they may not have travel plans that take them to or through Southeast Asia. Fortunately, Singapore Airlines has a decently sized list of diverse Fifth Freedom routes that allow Europeans and North Americans the chance to fly the carrier. Certainly on the short and sweet side, you won't be getting too far with these routes. Out of the 6 Singapore Airlines Fifth Freedom routes, there are just 2 short ones. Melbourne-Wellington, the SQ247 or 248, takes 3 to 3.5 hours long. It's operated by an Airbus A350-900, and Air New Zealand and Qantas also fly this route. And then Moscow-Stockholm, SQ361 or 362, also uses an Airbus A350-900. This short trip only takes around 2 hours and connects Moscow's Domodedovo Airport, or DME, with Stockholm Arlanda, or ARN. It doesn't appear that any other airline connects the 2 airports, although Aeroflot does fly to Arlanda from its hub at Moscow Sheremetyevo, or SVO. The carrier racks up some impressive distance, travelling on its 4 long-haul Fifth Freedom routes. Flying both Trans-Pacific and Transatlantic, these are its long-haul services. Hong Kong to San Francisco, with a very special flight number SQ1 and 2, this Trans-Pacific service is 14 to 15 hours one way and just over 11 hours going the other. This service is flown by either an A350-900 or a 777-300ER. Cathay Pacific and United Airlines are also serving this route. Tokyo to Los Angeles. This service has the flight numbers SQ11 and 12 and takes 9 hours going one way and 11.5 going the other. It's usually flown with a 777-300ER. This highly competitive route goes up against American Airlines, United Airlines, Delta Airlines, Japan Airlines and ANA. Manchester-Houston. SQ51 or 52 uses an Airbus A350 and seems to be the only flight connecting the 2 cities. The flight takes about 7.5 hours one way and 10 hours going in the other direction. As Houston is a United hub and Singapore Airlines is also a Star Alliance member, it would indicate a smoother transfer process for passengers connecting onto other US destinations via United's network. And then Frankfurt-New York. SQ25 or 26 is one of the few Fifth Freedom routes out there that still uses the Airbus A380 Super Jumbo. Interestingly, this service competes with its other Star Alliance members, United and Lufthansa Airlines. Although United flies out of its hub at Newark Liberty, one of Lufthansa's services between Frankfurt and New York also uses an A380. Going east, the flight takes 6 to 6.5 hours. Flying west, it's more like 8.5. While Singapore doesn't have a lengthy list of Fifth Freedom offerings, the few that it does have are quite interesting and offer passengers a lengthy amount of time to experience their highly regarded in-flight service. What's even better is the opportunity to fly in some great aircraft, including the A350-900 and the A380.
The sixth freedom of air essentially combines the 2 other freedoms of air, specifically the third and fourth freedoms of air. This means that an airline can carry passengers or cargo between 2 foreign countries, provided that the aircraft touches down in the airline's home country. The sixth freedom is not like the first 5, as it is not incorporated as such into widely recognized agreements amongst air services. Here is an example. Lufthansa carries sixth freedom traffic between Detroit and Tel Aviv, as it transports passengers traveling from Detroit to Frankfurt and then to Tel Aviv.
The seventh freedom of air states the right or privilege of airline companies to give service to passengers and to transport cargo between two countries without originating, touching down, or terminating in its home country. This just means that Philippine Airlines can transport passengers and/or cargo that originate not in the Philippines but in foreign countries like China to another foreign country such as the USA without touching down. Other examples of bilaterals are between New Zealand to United States and New Zealand to Australia that are granted by the seventh freedom of air permits the transport of Air New Zealand from Sydney directly to Los Angeles without the requirement of having a stop to a point in New Zealand.
The eighth freedom of air is also known as the consecutive cabotage. But what is cabotage? Cabotage is defined as the carriage of domestic passengers to another city of a foreign airline. With this, eighth freedom of air implies the privilege or right of an airline to transport passengers and freight from one city of an international country to another city of it which will be terminated in its home country, and vice versa. For the photo reference in the slide, this just means that Air Canada has the right to carry passengers and/or cargo from Chicago, USA to New York, USA, and touchdown to its home, Toronto, Canada. Vice versa, Air Canada has the privilege to give service from Toronto to Chicago and finally touchdown in New York, USA. Another example that can be used are bilaterals between New Zealand and Singapore, which allows Singapore Airlines to carry traffic from Singapore, pick up and drop off passengers to the biggest city in South Island of New Zealand, Christchurch, and finally departing in the capital of New Zealand, Wellington.
The ninth freedom right is to transport traffic between two domestic sites in a foreign nation. It is also known as open skies or complete cabotage privileges. It refers to a home nation's right to transport travelers within another country. It is also the same as the previously mentioned 8th freedom right, only the airline doesn't have to fly through its home state. So, ang pinaka madaling example nito is let's say AirAsia. So, hindi naman talaga sa Pilipinas yung base niya, pero meron siyang mga domestic flights dito sa Pilipinas. For example, Manila to Cebu, nakikater sila nun. So, yun yung 9th freedom.
That's the end of our video regarding the 9 freedoms of air. We hope that you learned something with our presentation. For more information, here's the list of our references that you can look up to. Once again, and as always, thank you for your time and for listening. Stay safe and God bless.